calm, hard talk. Now on BBC World, World Business Report.
It's the great wealth divide. The poor struggle to get a fair share of the world's riches. And eyeing the jackpot, the world's biggest casino group goes online. Hello, I'm Anisha Tank. This is World Business Report. Thanks so much for joining us. So the yawning gap between rich and poor is growing. The richest 2% of adults own around half of global household wealth, while the poorest half hold only 1%. Now that's the finding of researchers at the United Nations University. The global study includes financial assets and debts and property in its measure of wealth, but not salary. Most of the richest live in the US, Europe, and in the more prosperous Asian economies. Well, I'm joined by Anthony Shorrocks, who's one of the authors. He's based at the World Institute for Development Economics Research. That's part of the United Nations University. I know that normally you're in Helsinki, so thank you for being in London with us. A lot of people would listen to this and say, depending on which culture they're from, that they have a different definition for wealth. What was the definition that you used in this case?
Well, I think very often people use wealth and they use it in the same way as income. Our definition is assets that households own. So at the end of the year, if you were to tot up how much you had, how much was in the bank, how much you had in the way of shares, what your debts were, what the value of your house is, then that would give you the sort of idea of wealth that we are interested in here.
What was the obvious slant from this report? And I'm going to assume it was to the US, UK, Europe.
Well, in fact, most of the wealth in the world is owned by North America, Europe, and in particular Western Europe, and what we call the rich Asian Pacific countries, and Japan features very strongly there. They own around about 90% of total world wealth, and when you look at the top wealth holders, even more than 90% come from those regions.
Now, those proponents of free global trade, globalization, this sort of idea would say, in fact, income distribution is far more level in the current scenario than it would have been 20 years ago. Would you agree from the data that you've seen?
Well, of course, we're dealing with wealth here rather than income. I certainly think it's the case that wealth inequality has been increasing, and it is at least one of the factors is globalization, is in a sense on a global scale, it is increasing the pots, the fortunes that people make, but perhaps making a smaller number. So the idea is this winner takes all is quite prominent, I think, in wealth holdings. But this is at the top end, and of course we're looking at not just the rich and the super rich, but all wealth holdings at all levels.
Now, there's always a great deal of chat at the moment about China and India and Russia as being some of the places where we'll see pots of gold these days. Is that true?
Well, I think it's one of the striking results that these are the countries, I suspect there are obviously rich people in these countries, but when you look at it on a global scale, they're really an insignificant number. But that may change in the future, of course, and it's very likely, given the growth rates of China and India in particular, that they're going to become much more prominent in the top wealth groups.
And just finally, Anthony, where did you see the biggest surprise in the data?
Well, there's quite a few surprises. I think one of the interesting aspects is the relatively low wealth holdings in the Scandinavian region, where I'm currently located. These are rich countries. They appear right at the top of the rankings in income and human development, but their wealth is relatively low. And I think it's interesting that probably the reason for that is that there's less of a motivation for acquiring wealth. They have very good social security systems, so that they don't need to save for retirement. They don't need to save for ill health because they have good health systems. They have good unemployment insurance. And they don't need to really save for business reasons, because they can go and borrow money from banks if they need the funding to start businesses.
Right. Okay, we'll have to leave it there, unfortunately. It's been an education, though. Thank you very much, Anthony Shorrocks of the United Nations University. Now, the first US casino is entering the multi-billion-dollar online gaming market. Las Vegas Sands, or LVS, The world's largest casino group is teaming up with Cantor Gaming, but it comes just 3 months after the US brought in laws banning online gaming in the US.
In gambling, there are always winners and losers. Sometimes the trick is less about knowing what to do and more about knowing when to do it. Some European gambling companies have lost out because they moved too soon. They saw the United States as potentially a huge market and moved in there when the legislation was ill-defined. They've been caught out by changes in the law, and over the last 6 months their shares have collapsed. Party Gaming stock plunged 76%. 888 Holdings dropped 58%. bwin 75%. And Sportingbet 91%. Executives at companies like these faced arrest if they continued to take bets over the internet from American customers. Now a US company, Las Vegas